Hey everyone, this is Ina, in with you in the Fight Back. So, today I want to talk about Stalin on the national question. And this is actually probably one of the most important works that Stalin ever authored, and probably the one I've actually learned the most from. And I was actually at one point even assigned to read this in school, although I'd actually read it before. And I want to preface this by saying that I'd like to look at this work pretty much just as this work. I don't want to drag in Stalin's later career, for good or ill, into this discussion. I want to look at Stalin's work as a contribution to Marxism here. And that's what this work very much is. Because Stalin probably wrote the most important work of Marxism on the national question. And whatever critiques you make of it, it is still a great starting point. So what does he say? Well, Stalin defines a nation, and he kind of tells us that it is not just a racial or a tribal phenomena. A nation has five essential features, and these features are a stable, continuing community, a common language, a distinct territory, economic cohesion, and a collective character or a common psychological makeup. And all of these together make up a nation. A nation, of course, like anything that exists in the material world, is subject to the laws of dialectics and change. It has a history, a beginning, and end. And furthermore, a nation has to have the five features I elaborated upon, or Stalin elaborated upon. None of these features taken separately is enough to constitute a nation in the eyes of Stalin. Now, a nation comes into being with the rise of capitalism. The advent of a nation is due to the need of industry to establish a national market with a homogeneous population and a common market. And according to Stalin, nations first arose in Western Europe and later elsewhere. And Stalin actually probably offers a rather succinct definition of the nation. There are some questions about how arbitrary it is, and I've heard objections to Lenin supposedly not favoring the final of Stalin's five characteristics, the psychological makeup. Supposedly he had criticized that earlier. Lenin tended to approve of this work of Stalin's, and I'm going to take Lenin at his word here. Furthermore, there is a question that Trotsky posed, that this was essentially written under Lenin's guidance. I tend to believe, having read this and compared it with other Stalin's works, and looked at various biographies of Stalin, that this is very much his style. This really isn't. He certainly worked in collaboration with Lenin, but this is Stalin's work. And let's give the man his due here. And furthermore, there is a question, of course, that supposedly Stalin's definition of a nation is rather rigid, dogmatic, and it can often be applied that way. And you could just argue that his definition applies more to, say, Western or Eastern Europe as opposed to elsewhere in the world. And we can also question, well, Stalin is saying the nation comes into being with capitalism. What about the struggle of the Irish 900 years ago against England? Were they not a nation at that point? Or was Rome not a nation? Were the ancient Persians? And then there's the question of modern nations. According to Stalin's definition, we would have to dismiss the idea of the Swiss as a nation. And there are certain critiques to be made here. Stalin is also, furthermore, when he wrote this in 1913, at the behest of Lenin, he was arguing against the Austrian Marxists, particularly Otto Baer, they did not favor self-determination for the various nationalities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They wanted something called cultural autonomy, where the national minorities are given pretty much autonomous rights culturally within the nation. And this Stalin, along with Lenin, objected to this because it also divided the Austrian Social Democratic Party into various national federations and divided the trade union struggle. And Stalin also believed that the idea of cultural autonomy tended to favor interclass relations between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as if they shared a common framework within the nation, when rather the class struggle ultimately trumps any commonality nationally between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And in this case, Stalin is certainly correct. Stalin looks at Russia with its various oppressed nationalities. Russia before World War I was called the prison house of nations, with good reason. And Stalin himself came from a national minority within the Russian Empire, particularly Georgia. And he believes that workers within the Russian Empire should favor self-determination for nations, up to and including the right of secession from a particular national formation. So, under this, we can say the Poles oppressed by the Russian nation have the right to secede. But Stalin, he favors much more, although Marxists should uphold this right according to him. He believes that an idea of regional autonomy is probably the more optimal solution, where there are full rights for the nations in those areas, with their languages, their schools respected, and so forth. But Marxists should not, and so a socialist party should not be organized along national lines, particularly within the Russian Empire, where various Jewish groups and Polish groups were doing that, but rather along a single centralized party. And I believe there's something to be said for that as well. And furthermore, there is a question, and I think many people who pose this tend to be a little unfair to Stalin at this point. I know that sounds strange coming from me, but supposedly, and I've read this critique before, that Stalin doesn't distinguish so much between the nationalism of, say, a great power like Russia, and the nationalism, on the other hand, of, say, the oppressed nations, say, Poland or Georgia. And we can say whatever we want about Stalin's later career. I believe that this type of distinction kind of flows from the work as itself, and although Lenin makes this distinction in his work, it is not quite found here. But to be fair, I think Stalin would say to read Lenin's work along with his, to be absolutely fair to this. And Stalin's work on the national question, of course, made him pretty much the party expert on nationalism, so much that he was appointed the Commissar of Nationalities after the Bolshevik Revolution. Whether or not he was successful in that endeavor is something we can discuss later. But this work is very much a starting point for Marxists on the national question. It should not be the end point. And other Marxists, of course, have contributed to the national question. James Connolly, who I've spoken of, Rosa Luxemburg, who did not favor national self-determination. And in this case, despite probably my greater admiration for Rosa Luxemburg, she was dead wrong on this question, and Stalin was right. And furthermore, Lenin, of course, Tom Naran, Eric Hobsbawm, Mao Zedong, of course, Ho Chi Minh, and Fidel Castro have all, in their own ways, contributed to ideas of Marxism and the national question. And I hope this has been rather informative. As you can see, I've tried to keep out a lot of the polemical debates and to look at Stalin's work on its own merit. And despite whatever criticisms I have brought up, I tend to think that this work holds up rather well, although I, of course, urge you to read all works with a critical and open mind. This is Ina. Until next time.